On this week's 51%, we explore how building for the future can require reckoning with our past. Social psychologist Dolly Chugh offers guidance for the gritty patriot in her new book, A More Just Future.
We don't have to choose between loving our country or bashing our country. I just reject that premise.
And we also hear from therapist and life coach Erika Camilli about how to break your own bad habits and seek lasting positive change. I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. I'm Jessie King. Thanks for joining us. Last week we kicked off the new year by discussing some of the most common New Year's resolutions, namely eating healthier, working out, and nurturing our relationships. But today I thought we'd start by taking a more general approach, because there's no end to the resolutions out there. So how can we best set goals for ourselves and find success? How do you kick a bad habit and pick up a new, healthy one? I recently spoke with Erika Camilli, a licensed creative arts therapist, certified life coach, and Reiki master with Nuvance Health's partial hospitalization program at Putnam Hospital in New York's Hudson Valley. Recognizing your behaviors, goal setting, and habit breaking are a big part of what they do. She says it's all about knowing yourself and being kind to yourself.
When we're looking at setting goals, we want it to be obviously realistic. We want to be able to actually get there. We don't want to set ourselves up for disaster and for disappointment. And we also don't want ourselves to get frustrated along the way. We want to make it as enjoyable as we can, because what happens when we're doing something that we're not enjoying? We end up giving up. So when we're looking at goals, especially with healthy ones, it's always, I want to eat healthier, I want to get to the gym, I want to lose weight, and it's all great. But I did read an article that people usually stop their New Year's resolution at day 17 from making it a habit, which is wild.
Yeah, we're coming right up around that.
Right. Where people are like, this is too hard, this is too much time. It's definitely a really big change because we're usually all or nothing people and we thoroughly enjoy routine as well. So in ways to make it manageable, we want to kind of build mastery with that. We want to break it down into small steps that can accumulate bigger change. So instead of going, especially if you're someone who's not an active person, just taking exercise for an example, we're not going to go from, let me sit on the couch to, I'm going to go to the gym 5 days a week and I'm going to run 3 miles a day. That's not going to be realistic. And you're going to get very tired of that and frustrated and you're going to give up. So instead of what can I do 2 days out of the week, 3 days out of the week, even just for 10 minutes to kind of start this routine for myself that I can then build on as it gets easier.
How long does it usually take to try to make a new habit and have it stick?
I love that you asked that question because I was honestly looking up articles on it. Because, the old answer is 21 days, right? It takes 21 days to form a habit. I always like to say 22 just to kind of get in that extra day. But as I was reading and looking up some articles, it could be anywhere from 22 days to 62 days to 295 days. It really depends, I think, on the individual person, the consistency of it. And again, if you make it enjoyable and manageable for yourself. I work very well with structure and time frame. You have to work with the kind of person that you are. So knowing yourself best is really important.
If you're trying to kick a habit, whether it's something small like biting your nails or being late or something much larger, what should you keep in mind about that process? I'm assuming just from my own experience that it's not linear.
No, it's not, right? Because any kind of progress is progress. Small progress is progress. It's moving in the right direction. And you're right, it is not linear. You're going to take steps back. You're going to, we like to call it relapse, right? You're going to do all these things. But as long as you are really doing your best to move forward, bringing yourself to become really aware of when you're doing these things, how you're feeling when you're doing these things, how you feel after you do them, and having a non-judgmental mentality about it as well. So like not shaming ourselves if we mess up, not viewing ourselves in a negative way, also getting out of the I should be doing this, right? Because it's so judgmental. We had someone who said you shouldn't shit all over yourself. And making it more of I want and I get to do this. Like I'm choosing to do these things for myself. I'm choosing healthier things. Just even the change in your verbiage can change your whole outlook on new behaviors and kicking old ones. But just coming to the level of awareness, whether it's working with a therapist with it or having someone accountable that you're kind of checking in with on a daily basis, would be really helpful. Having that support around you, talking to people about it, not being ashamed of it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask sort of like the role that accountability plays in all of this and what makes a good accountability partner.
Someone who's not judgmental, someone who you trust, someone who has your best interests at heart and cares for you. I think those are all really great ones. I come from a big family. I have 3 sisters. So we're very, very close. We are always talking about, hey, I'm trying to reach this goal, or I'm working towards running a 5K. I'm working on not biting my nails so much. I'm working on making healthier choices for myself. And sometimes you just have someone there that when you're actively, because it's unconscious, right? Because it's a behavior. When you're doing it, that can just be like, hey, I'm noticing that you're doing this, and even just a little tap to interrupt that behavior is really nice, just in a subtle way.
Now, lastly, your realm includes art therapy and Reiki. Can those things help you out on this front too?
Yes. Vision boards. I love vision boards. I always think that when you think of a goal, a habit, healthier changes that you would like to bring into your everyday life, we have them in an abstract realm, right? They're thoughts. So they can come and go as they please. They kind of disappear. We push them to the background, especially when we're busy with life. But then when you start writing it down, creating a vision board, visualizing it, you bring it into this concrete realm where now it's real. It's on paper. You're kind of writing a contract for yourself. Then what you can start doing is you can start making a plan for it. And then you can bring it into the action realm of really creating a plan of steps to bring it into a realistic realm for yourself that works best for you.
Erika Camilli is a licensed creative arts therapist, certified life coach, and Reiki master with Nuvance Health out of Putnam Hospital's partial hospitalization program in the Hudson Valley. Now that we've done a little personal development, let's broaden the scope. Our main guest today is Dolly Chugh, a social psychologist and professor at the NYU Stern School of Business. For years, Chugh has dedicated her research to what she calls the psychology of good people. In her first book, The Person You Mean to Be, Chugh set out to help readers let go of the idea of being a good person, identify their own biases, and work toward becoming a better person. Now in her latest title, A More Just Future, Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change, Chugh tackles our relationship with patriotism and our country as a whole. Chugh says the idea for the book came from her own experience raising her children. About a decade ago, she started reading the Little House on the Prairie series to her kids every night. After getting through all 8 books, she even planned a family vacation to the Ingalls homestead in the Midwest, dressing everyone up in prairie dresses and patting herself on the back for the cool mom she was, showing her children the world. But as she stood under the South Dakota sun, taking in the landscape in front of her, she suddenly had a realization.
Wait a minute. Whose land was this before the Ingalls built their little house on it? And of course, we all know that it was land that belonged to the Native Americans and the families and communities that had been built there. And when that thought, which I intellectually understand to be true, came to my mind in that moment, I just shut it down. That parenting pride about exposing my kids to things and sharing them, I just shut it down. I did not know how to deal with it. I did not know how to talk about it. I didn't know how to deal with the own emotions I was feeling of like, how come I hadn't thought of this before? And how come I actually don't know that much to even share with them? And so I just didn't deal with it. And that was, over a decade ago. And in the years since then, the psychologist in me has come back to that moment many times and wondered, I'm not a historian. I'm not even really a history buff, but I am someone who's interested in like emotions and people. And I wondered kind of what was shutting me down. What is this emotional relationship we have with our country's complicated past? And was there a way that maybe I could have been able to deal with that moment differently and help my kids understand something rather than kind of punting for them to figure it out on their own at some later point?
In the book, you state this kind of whitewashing of American history is not at all uncommon, that it permeates our textbooks, museums, and so forth. But you also offer up a number of tools to help readers get more comfortable with facing our country's history. Would you like to share a couple of those tools?
Absolutely. One of them is the paradox mindset. This is research that Wendy Smith and Marianne Lewis have done with colleagues where they help us see how our brains are wired to want consistency. We want to, like, when we see the picture on the wall that's a little crooked, we want to straighten it. And our brain does that with our thoughts as well. It just wants everything to line up. That need for consistency, that craving for consistency, natural as it is, it can also run at odds with what happens in the real world. Consider, for example, in American history, how our founding fathers had these extraordinary visions and wrote extraordinary documents and overcame extraordinary odds in building our country. At the same time that they were doing that, they also displayed extraordinary inhumanity. They were enslaving other human beings. They were separating parents from children. They were torturing people who resisted this treatment. And I even get kind of like, I feel like so gross even saying that out loud. And it certainly is in contradiction with the first set of statements I made about our founding fathers. That contradiction or that paradox, our brain is going to want to resist it because it's not, the picture's crooked on the wall. However, what the research shows is we can tell our brains, paradox alert, spotted one. It's okay for that inconsistency to exist. And when we do what's called activating a paradox mindset, our brain will actually loosen up and allow that paradox to exist. There is so much paradox in our country's past. And when we resist, when we only want to know half of the story, just the beautiful part, not the brutal part, it makes it a lot harder to understand the world we live in today. So that's one tool that I've found really helpful, activating a paradox mindset that will allow us to bring in a fuller story. And the research says, when we embrace paradox, we're more creative in our problem solving and we're more resilient when things kind of don't feel right. We can push through. And resilience and creativity go a long way in today's complicated world.
Okay, so we've got paradoxes. You also make a point in the book to say that our history has its fair share of fables. And you point out some common signs of fables, or fabling, whatever you want to call it, and that we can learn from that too.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a spoiler, but I'll share it. In the book, I share the fable of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is one of the most recognized names in the world, and certainly in the United States. And we all know her story. We've learned it since we were young, that she was this accidental activist who was tired and when coming home from work as a seamstress, and she was elderly and found herself on a bus, segregated. As a Black woman, she was expected to give up her seat to the white person who wanted it, and she wouldn't do it. And that led to what became the Montgomery bus boycott and was a catalyst of the civil rights movement. It turns out almost nothing I just said was true. Let's begin with the fact that she was 42 years old, far from elderly. She was not an accidental activist. She had a lifelong history of activism, devoted many hours every single week. Being a seamstress paid the bills, but what fueled her soul was her activism for the NAACP. When she was a young teenager, her family actually moved neighborhoods because the neighborhood they lived in required her to interact with white students who expected her to move off the sidewalk when they were there, and she refused to do it. And they were worried for her safety if she continued to resist that expectation. And so this lifelong history of being what historian Jean Thea Harris calls rebellious is at odds with the fable we've learned. Now, the question is, why does that matter? I mean, is it sort of like fun facts to know for a trivia night, or is it meaningful? And I argue, and others like Jean Thea Harris argue, that it's incredibly important that we understand the true story, because the fable makes it sound like change happens in linear ways, that there's one moment of resistance that leads to change. And in fact, what the true story is there's many moments of failed resistance that don't lead to change. And then eventually there might be some breakthrough, and then it goes backwards, and then it goes forward. And when we change our mental expectation of what change looks like and what resistance looks like, it helps us understand how to make change today, so that we're not falling for the Instagrammed version of what a change effort or what a civil rights movement looks like. We understand the reality of what it looks like.
I was going to ask, once we accept our past, how do we move forward and drive change from there?
Absolutely. I mean, that is really where the meat is. One of the things we do is we let go of the nostalgia we have for the way we wish change happened, that fable I just described. There's a very nostalgic version of what that looks like. There's a nostalgic version some people have of the past or of our country. Going forward, recognizing that we have that yearning for nostalgia, and then having the grit, what I call being a gritty patriot, in advocating and fighting for and learning what is actually true. Grit, many of us are familiar with this idea from Angela Duckworth, from her TED Talk and her best-selling book and her groundbreaking research, where grit is passion and perseverance in pursuit of a meaningful long-term goal. A lot of us have meaningful long-term goals in our jobs and in our hobbies and our families. So we know how to have grit in challenging situations. But when it comes to our country and our love of country and our aspirations for our country, I think we tend to have more of an expectation that that's going to be an easy love. It's not going to require grit. My proposal going forward is that we adopt this idea of gritty patriotism, where we're going to have to work for that love of country. We're going to have that passion and perseverance push us through towards the meaningful long-term goal of building the country that our founding fathers originally envisioned. And that's going to take something that isn't going to just be an easy love, but sometimes it's going to require us to love with a broken heart in order to get to the other side.
To kind of take it back to that more personal level, do you have any advice for those struggling with, I guess, what you called the emotional side of this reckoning? How should you approach any potential shame or guilt you have?
Let's just name that that's normal. Anytime we believe something and that belief is, there's a crack in it, I call it belief grief. It is a form of grief. It is something we loved, something we cherished that is no longer completely whole. And that feeling of grief, whether it's shame, it's guilt, it's anger, it's disbelief. I mean, that's why I wrote this book. It came from a personal place of living in those emotions myself and noticing so many other people are as well. The patriot's dilemma, that meaning this idea that when we love something deeply, it's harder to actually face the reality of it, is a normal thing. So I think we begin with that, of rather than trying to pick, well, then I'm just going to live in the darkness of the terrible parts of the history only, or I'm only going to live in the brightness of the country's history. We don't have to choose. We can normalize the fact that we live in this paradoxical, sometimes grieving state in order to get to a better place. And then once we do that, another thing that is really helpful is taking the stance of reminding ourselves of what psychologists call our values and affirming those values. What are the values we care most about as Americans, and this could be individual, for one person it might be freedom, for another person it might be independence, for another person it might be equality. But revisiting those often allow us to sort of elevate ourselves above the trenches of, are we going to teach this in schools or not teach this in schools? Are we going to, rename this? Are we going to take down this monument? I mean, all the day-to-day sort of navigation we have to do of these complicated issues, raising them ourselves in our minds up to what are the things I value? What are the values I want to keep coming back to? Doing that, the research on values affirmation shows that we're able to sort of push through that kind of drudgery and the tougher stuff in a more persistent way.
As you just alluded to, the subject is at the forefront of our societal discourse right now. You have things like critical race theory being debated or attempts to ban it in schools, criticism of the use of certain books in school curriculums and libraries. I guess just to elaborate for me a little bit, what do you, as a social psychologist, make of this current culture war?
I think it's because we're in this mindset that we feel we have to choose. Will we focus on America's greatest hits, or will we kind of go into this very demoralizing, awful vision of our country? The answer is it's a both and. Like, we don't have to choose between being a patriot or being a wokester, and I'm using language other people use, between loving our country or bashing our country. I mean, I just reject that premise. And kids are especially well equipped to handle paradox. I think as we get older, it gets tougher and tougher to reconcile. We have more to unlearn, but kids are much better able to do it. And if we can teach them early to be able to see and navigate these emotions, to be able to talk about racism and the role it's played in our country, they will be better equipped to deal with it. They won't have this false choice in mind that they have to either love or bash their country.
Well, Dolly, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me. That was all the questions that I had for you, but is there anything that I'm missing that you'd like our listeners to know?
I would just say that the future ahead will be so much clearer if we understand the past we came from. And that's what I've learned as someone who is very much a learner in this space, is our emotional relationship with our country and with our fellow Americans. A lot of it sits in being able to understand the world we're in today and what it's going to look like tomorrow. So wrestling with these emotions, there's such a payoff for us ahead. And I hope that my work offers the tools that lead us to that more hopeful, inspired place.
Dolly Chugh is an award-winning social psychologist at the NYU Stern School of Business, where she dedicates her research to what she calls the psychology of good people. Her latest book is A More Just Future: Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change. It's out now through Atria Books, and her website is Dolly Chugh, that's CHUGH.com. Dolly, thanks again.
Thank you for including my work.
Our last guest today is June Montgomery Tabron, President and CEO of the Kellogg Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the U.S., dedicated to helping vulnerable children by working with communities to create the conditions they need to reach their full potential. A big part of that, according to Tabron, is promoting racial equity, creating a more just future, as we just heard from Dolly Chugh. And part of that involves racial healing. WKKF is recognizing its 7th annual National Day of Racial Healing on Tuesday, January 17th, encouraging citizens and organizations to learn, hold events, and take part in meaningful conversations on the subject. I recently spoke with Tabron to learn more.
This is a day that is supported by the Kellogg Foundation, and it results from our work. People and communities across the nation actually want to engage in practices that promote racial healing and racial equity. And what we know is that there are many others that want to do so as well, but they don't quite know how. So this day is one that we believe is essential to support the actions of people to come together and begin to connect around what we can create so that everyone has an opportunity to thrive.
So you've dedicated a large part of your work and career toward achieving racial equity. How does having these meaningful conversations and working towards racial healing ultimately get us to equity?
Absolutely. The first step, we believe, the heart to racial equity is connecting people with one another and getting us back to building trusting relationships that are just about our humanity. And that's what we believe is at the heart of racial equity, because once you're in a space and in community with one another, then you can take collective action that changes and makes opportunities exist for everyone.
It sounds like it all contributes to just getting people in a room, like getting people to work together.
At the core of it, it is the collective action. While, many people go straight to the systems and structures that need to change, we believe that we first must start with building and affirming our humanity. As we host our National Day of Racial Healing, what we like to do in these times is actually show the action that is happening, show how it happens, and all the progress that we've already made in this space. I think the most important thing that this National Day does is it changes a narrative that isn't a narrative that is happening in communities across the nation. While the national narrative may be more divisive, the narrative that people will see and connect with is a narrative of how change is happening every day in communities and how together people are understanding what barriers exist in their communities, and they're working together to change those. There are policies changing around housing, education, economic opportunity, but we don't really understand the impact of these systems until we connect with the people and we speak with them.
But what advice do you have for people trying to have those conversations on racial healing with their community, with their neighbors, with their friends, and their loved ones this year?
Yes, and there are some very specific values. The first that I love to talk about is this is a place where there is no blame and no shame. This is about affirmation and allowing everyone to tell their story. And it's a space where you also listen. You listen, you learn, we connect those stories, and together we begin to see our common humanity. And through that connection, we begin to build the trusting relationships that we need to make the transformations that we need in our communities. People maybe find it intimidating, but what I can tell you is throughout the practice, you find a way to connect across differences that is productive.
June Montgomery Tabron is the president and CEO of the WK Kellogg Foundation, which focuses on improving conditions for children in vulnerable communities. Its 7th annual National Day of Racial Healing is Tuesday, January 17th. That night, MSNBC and Telemundo will be airing 2 town halls on the subject, Telemundo at 7 p.m. and MSNBC at 10 p.m. You can also find a list of events in your state at dayofracialhealing.org. June, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan. Our executive producer is Dr. Alan Chartock. And our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. A big thanks to Erika Camilli, Dolly Chugh, and June Montgomery Tabron for taking the time to speak with me. To learn more about our guests and the show, check us out at WAMCpodcast.org. There you can find episodes new and old and links to everything you need to know. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King, 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot rain on the concrete, sweet melting little girl dreams. The it.